Hello and welcome to week 13 of Race and Ethnicity. For this week, you're going to be reading chapter 10. Chapter 10 is very deep. It starts off talking about the social position of African American women during slavery and how they were owned by the plantation owners, including how they owned their womb. This had a great effect on the African American family, which has lasted all the way up until the present. Then it gets in the association between race and social class, where the effect of poverty upon African Americans and Hispanics, for example, has had major effects on the family, and there's a direct association between that and single parent mothers, for example. The book also talks about interracial marriage. It talks about the rates of interracial marriage and how it was common prior to when the beginning of the country was started. However, then over a couple of years after that, interracial marriage became taboo and stayed that way for hundreds of years. And now that people are freed up again and attitudes toward interracial marriage has improved, you're seeing that it has, gone up by 5 times as much just in the last few decades. And a lot of this because marriage patterns are associated with your race, for example. This kind of goes into the idea of in-group versus out-group. Who do we marry are the people that we have proximity with, for example. And then if you look at segregation and how whites and non-whites have been separated and segregated for so long, and that interracial marriage, there was prejudice and discrimination toward that for a very long time, you can see how things like race affect simple things like who you choose to marry, the population that you're picking from to marry. And so I like to think about it like, again, I stopped calling myself white a long time ago once I studied the biology of race and realized that I'm just very blended like everybody else on the planet. It freed me up because by not thinking of myself as white, then it opened up the door to be able to hang out with anybody because I no longer had outgroups, for example. It just frees you up. So that was a really interesting thing that happened to me, and you're starting to see that in modern times. But this, again, is such a deep concept because when you get into things like interracial marriage, the effect of race on the family, the effect of race on the economy, for example, like how social positions and what kind of job you're allowed to take and how much money you can get is based upon your race. There's at least an association there because all minorities were restricted to the lower classes, for example. And this chapter is talking about all of this and how all of it is just affecting each other. It's this idea of intersectionality, which the book kind of concludes with in chapter 10. And it's the idea that your race and your social class and your sex are all associated, okay? And they all affect the main institutions of society, like the family, and they're affected by the economy, the institutions of society, okay? So again, there's so much deep stuff at work here. I mean, when you start looking at like marriage selection and who you choose to marry and how that's affected by race, you got to ask some really hard questions. So commonly in diversity classes, I'll have people construct a survey and they go out and study attitudes toward interracial marriage, and you have to be honest about it because implicit bias does exist. And they've done the implicit bias test for millions of people and found that we all have this implicit bias toward favoring white over non-white. Even African Americans favor white over non-white. And the book got into this idea of implicit bias. But this implicit bias comes from stereotypes about race. And these stereotypes about race then affect the people we hang out with. And it also affects things like power and prestige and economic opportunities. And it's just a whole big, giant, beautiful picture. And so I kind of hope as you guys read this chapter, you start to see all the connections between all of that, okay? So you guys are going to read chapter 10, which covers all of these subjects, and you're going to complete the inquisitive on chapter 10. Then you're going to watch these amazing video on interracial dating. And this gets into what I'm talking about with people's actual attitudes toward interracial marriage. And you can kind of see that depending on how people were socialized, what was the social context like? What kind of ideology were they exposed to, for example? This then affects their attitudes toward interracial marriage and whether or not they find it acceptable, for example, okay? So please, this is it's a pretty long video. It's about an hour and 15 minutes, skim through it and just definitely start focusing on what they're saying and then looking at how different people are saying different themes and then start pulling out the common themes And that's what you want to write about for this, okay? So you're going to write a 500-word analysis on the question, does geography affect interracial dating? And then the common themes associated with this video that you found, okay? So if you have any questions, please email me and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.